Thanks for joining me today for episode 41 of Podcasting Your Brand. I'm your host, producer Jemmy, providing learning lessons for you to podcast your brand. And today I'm going to share part 3 of this series of episodes, the technical side of launching, also known as your trailer track and show art. This episode is brought to you by my own brand, Flintstone Media. Listen in and let's do this. Hello. Welcome to part 3 of the technical side of launching. We have just 2 episodes left in this journey through the show development and launch space of podcasting your brand. First, the conceptual side of your launch with my Thoughts Before Launching series, and now the technical side of launching your podcast. Moving forward past these episodes, I'll be labeling my episodes as either Podcasting Level 101 or Level 102. Because we are just starting to get into the massive pile of tips, to-dos, and Jemmy-isms that will help you to best podcast your brand. But let's not get ahead of ourselves quite yet. In this episode, I'm going to bring you through steps 5 and 6 of the technical process of launching your show, covering the 2 pieces you have to have in order to submit your show to the platforms. I'll be talking in the next episode about getting your show onto the podcast platforms, but to get ready for that, you need to have your trailer track and your show art. Well, now that you've come along with me this far and figured out how to record, it's time to decide what's the first thing you're going to say. That's your trailer episode. But first, a little history. When I first got into podcasting, way the flip back in 2014, and for a number of years thereafter, it could take up to 2 or 3 weeks to get your show approved in the big kahuna platform, Apple iTunes. So that created quite a conundrum because having an episode loaded into your podcasting account is required in order to submit your show to iTunes. Well, so if you're wanting to announce that you were launching your show on a certain date, and then you were waiting to release your first episode on that date to then submit it to the platforms, no one could listen to it yet. Sometimes for a very long time. You see the problem here, ruh-roh? Imagine setting up an entire marketing campaign, telling all your friends and family about it, scheduling a Facebook Live party for it, whatever, and there's nothing for people to listen to. 4 weeks! Nothing but crickets for weeks. And the date that it would magically get approved could be anytime. 2 weeks later, 2 days later, who knew? So a trailer track was very useful in solving this problem. You'd create a trailer track, submit your show to the platforms weeks ahead of when you'd hope your official launch date would actually be. You'd have then plenty of time to create more marketing materials, record another episode or 2, book a couple of more guests, like whatever you need to do. That's how it worked. But that's not really the case anymore, and it hasn't been now for a couple of years. The platforms have come a long way, and now they approve your shows sometimes like instantaneously, typically within about maybe 2 to 3 hours now, and in a few rare cases, a couple of days. Like tune-in can still take a couple of days. But in my effort to keep this show as evergreen as possible, and especially these launch process episodes, I'm going to assume that by the time you are hearing this, it might very well be instantaneous on all platforms. So is it still important to talk about and put together a trailer episode? In my opinion, yes, a trailer episode is still a really great opportunity to introduce yourself to your audience and to let your audience know what to expect from your show. But there are traditionally 2 different schools of thought on how to actually accomplish and execute this. Mainly, the debate is, should your first episode be an introduction of yourself to your audience, thus likely also being an episode that's very different in format from everything else you're going to do on every future episode of your show? That's one option. Or should it be an episode that is just like every other episode? Like just dive right in and give your audience an immediate serving of your show's normal content. Tricky. Well, in playing with this back and forth debate over the years, I've come up with two other options to consider, and I've actually used them personally. So, okay, let's start though with these first two. First up, the traditional trailer. So a traditional trailer is an introduction of yourself to your audience. That's, like I said, it's likely very different from your normal episode. So if you have a show where you have guests on your show, then a trailer episode might just be you saying, "Hi, I am so-and-so, and this show is about thus and such." And that's really it. Very different from all your other episodes. The second option would be just to dive in with a regular episode, an episode that is just like every other episode you're going to deliver moving forward. But as I said, in launching dozens of shows over the years across the evolution of podcasting, I eventually came up with a couple other ideas. So the third one is a mashup approach. With this approach, you prep a regular show with all the regular content value that you're going to have in every other episode moving forward, right? Kind of like the second option of just a regular episode. But you describe the concept and the format of the show along the way, kind of giving them what you would in the traditional trailer. Now, on an old show of mine, People of Florida, I had a trailer episode, a traditional episode 0, simply because that was launched back when there was still an unpredictably long wait time when submitting your show to the platform. So I still had a traditional trailer as a placeholder to submit that show. But for episode 1 of that show, which that show had 3 segments, so episode 1 also had all 3 segments, I explained each segment along the way. So in episode 1, I took a moment to introduce myself as the host, say, "Hi, I'm producer Jeremy, and then I explained how the first part of each episode would be me interviewing a notable Floridian. I talked briefly on what kinds of guests the listener could expect I would have on the show, and then I introduced my first guest, Mr. Michaela, who's an aura reader out of Boynton Beach, and played the interview. Then, as a second segment on that show, I would invite a guest storyteller to join me on the microphone and tell me about an interesting Floridian in history. So on the first episode, I began by explaining that this segment was on a historical Floridian, as opposed to the first segment featuring a current Floridian. And essentially that these guest storytellers were going to be teaching me, and also therefore you as a listener, about a piece of Florida history. Then I explained who my guest storytellers would be: tour guides and reps from visitors bureaus around the state, news reporters, college historians, etc., etc. Then I introduced my first guest storyteller, Kevin Wojciechowski from Visit Tampa Bay, and played our segment together. Then I led into the final segment of the show by explaining that I would be sharing weird and funny stories from my own crazy life. And then I shared one of those stories on episode 1. So as you can see, the layout of that first episode killed 2 birds with one stone. I both explained the structure of the show and who I was as the host, while also providing the content that would be included in every normal episode thereafter. So I'll include a link in the show notes to that trailer episode so you can hear it and actually listen to how it came out. And the other concept that I came up with as I was toying with trailer episodes is what I did on this show, a sizzle reel introduction. So when I was transitioning this show from Business in the Bedroom, which then became season 1, to Podcasting Your Brand, which is now season 2 moving forward, this is what I did. So essentially what you're going to do is take past content and repurpose it to introduce your new content. And this past content can come from your own past stuff, a previous podcast, your YouTube channel, wherever. Or, as in my case for this show, I took clips from my appearances on other people's podcasts as a way of showcasing the kind of content that I would be sharing here. So I shared a handful of these Sizzle clips as just examples of the kind of tips and content that people would hear moving forward on this show. So I'll include a link in the show notes to the transitional sizzle reel episode for this show, which was episode 32, in case you want to rewind back to that one and hear how I pulled that one off. All right, let's move on to step 6 in the technical side of launching your podcast, creating your show art. Your show art is the visual element that represents your show, like an icon or a logo. When people find your show in their podcast player, your show art is the image that is displayed. Now, there are some main specifications required for your show art to be accepted across all platforms, but they're very, very simple. Number 1, make it square shaped, so give it that 1-to-1 ratio. Number 2, has to have a minimum size of 1400 by 1400 pixels. And number 3, a maximum size of 3000 by 3000 pixels. And there are 2 other specs that more often than not make the list, but most images that meet these first 3 requirements, the 1-to-1 ratio, minimum 1400, maximum 3000, they typically also meet these other 2 requirements. So don't stress over them, but they're worth mentioning. So number 4, that the image is under 500 kilobytes in file size. And number 5, that it uses the RGB color space. Like I said, as long as you have a square image that is between 1400 and 3000 pixels, you should be good to go. But there are some key points to discuss in terms of the design of your show art as well. And they're really, really important. The key is that it's important to be able to see all of the elements of your show art, even when it displays very, very small, like on a podcast player app. What's awesome about where we're at in the podcasting space these days is more and more people are using their podcast player as a search engine. So if they want to find out about a topic, they'll search for it in their podcast player. But of course, that generates a number of shows to pop up. So each show's show art icon displays really small. So you need to make sure that you're able to see all the elements of your show art, even when it displays really small like that. The most important, though, is your show's name. You want the font of your show's name to be big and bold. And you may have other words on your show art as well. Your name, your show's tagline, if you have one, ongoing sponsor's name. And you need to make sure that those can be seen once it's a little bit bigger. But when it's small and at all times, you want to at least be able to read your show's name. So make sure the font is big, bold, and easy to read when displayed small. And you will likely, not always, but likely want to also include some visual elements in your show art as well. And you want to be able to see all of those elements on your show art, even when it's small. I'm going to keep saying that. You want to make sure your eyes can make out what all little things are, even when it's displayed really small, because it'll get displayed small on podcast player apps. So aside from the words that may be included on your show art, like your show name, tagline, your name, etc., you may want to also include some visual elements on your show art. Elements like what? Well, elements that are both relevant to your show's content and descriptive of the value. For example, guess what's the iconic image in the art for the Horse Radio Network? I'll give you a second. A horse! Yay! Ding, 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 ding. You got it. It's a horse. And when it comes to design, you also want to mind your colors. Firstly, if you have colors that are already associated with your brand, use those same colors. Use your color palette if you have one. If you don't have a styling palette of colors for your brand, then use colors that pop, colors that are going to make your show art stand out. Then make sure that your background doesn't wash out your text elements, stuff like that. So make sure your colors work well together. Next, I want to touch on a heated debate. Whether or not to have your own image on your show art. Well, there's no clear-cut answer on that matter. But I would say that you want to consider having your image on your show art if one of two things is true in particular. Number one, if your image can help convey the feel of your show. So for example, a calm, smiling photo of you that can convey that your show is a safe space. Or an image of you in a party hat and celebrating with maybe a glass of champagne or something to convey that your show has a party feel to it, that kind of a thing. And the second reason would be, well, if you're already famous, then yeah, duh. Capitalize on the public image you've already built. But other than that, it's honestly not terribly necessary. And if it takes up space that could be better used in other ways on your show art, you might want to consider just leaving it out. I went back and forth as to whether to have my own image on my show art for this show. And ultimately, there are various versions of my show art. And I thought that most of them should show my image in some way. And here's why I decided that for me. Because I'm a Black woman offering podcasting advice, and my own demographics might make someone more comfortable tapping on my show because I'll offer something a bit different than most of the other podcasts about podcasting, or say it in a different way, or offer different background stories that may feel more relevant to that person who's searching for that advice. So I ultimately decided to put my face in most versions of the show art. Okay, now a quick list of some do's and don'ts. And to be quite frank, I'm pulling these from episode 6 of the Podfest podcast, my other show, when Glenn and I talked about putting together good show art. So I'm kind of plagiarizing myself, but I think that's technically allowed. But I'll include a link to the Podfest podcast, episode 6, in the show notes, of course, so you can hear our full discussion on these if you'd like. But a couple of quick to-dos. As I mentioned, people are using podcast apps as search engines, so make sure that when you're designing it, keep in mind that your show art has to be eye-catching. Also, your visual elements should help tell the story and scope of your show's content. One show that I helped design the show art for is called Broken Law, and so there's a traditional image of legal scales, but they're broken. So your visuals, along with even the feel of the font you choose, every piece needs to really, really convey what your show is about. And when in doubt or looking for inspiration, check out what others have done, not just other podcasts that are already serving your space. No. Compare your art to show art of all kinds of podcasts from all over the place to see if any ideas or tweaks jump out at you that can help you with your own show art design. And a rundown of a few no-nos. No-no number 1, too much writing. It comes off jumbled. No one wants to read it. They're here for audio advice. So don't put too much writing on your show art. Also, again, I know I belabored the point, but make sure that your art looks good in all sizes. So it's a terrible, terrible, terrible idea to skip that final step. When you feel like you have really, really good show art, just test that composition by shrinking it down to about at most an inch, right? And see if it still looks good. Can you still tell what your show is and what it's about? And for the love of all that's holy, we are now many, many, many years into the industry of podcasting. Podcasting awareness has taken off. People know a podcast involves microphones, so you don't necessarily have to put a microphone in your show art. But if you do, you definitely don't still have to put the old radio microphone in your show art. It's one of those things that's becoming just one of those things. just try to avoid it. All right, and now a few final words on 3 other things for you to take note on, and then I'll let you go. Okay, number 1, once you've landed on your final show art composition, save not only the final full image, but also each individual element of your graphic, your title, your tagline, any visual elements, etc. Save them as separate PNG files with transparent backgrounds. You want to save those for use on your website, on future marketing and promotional materials. You just never know. So save all the different little elements as well. Number 2, create an additional version of your show art that has a horizontal rather than just the square orientation. Some hosting account companies, which we'll get into on the next episode, allow you to load up both a square and a horizontal version of your show art because some platforms will use either in different places on their platforms. So you want to provide both just in case it uses both. Why not, right? And the size of that horizontal image should be 1600 by 900. And third, make sure your show art doesn't accidentally draw unwanted attention. So, as a quick note, the Finding Florida logo, it's great. It's one of my favorite logos that I've ever had a hand in designing. And essentially, it's someone holding up binoculars. It's a great, solid piece of show art. But once it gets put on a t-shirt with a woman wearing it, let's just say it looks kind of like the hands might be holding something else. So make sure that your show art doesn't accidentally draw unwanted attention. Oh my gosh, this is true. So you could see samples of strong show art in my grid of clients on the Flintstone Media website. Just go to flintstonemedia.com/clients. Now, we didn't help design all of the show art that's listed there. We only design show art for about maybe half of our clients, but I'll include some of my favorites, whether we design them or not, directly in the show notes for this episode. In fact, I'll include the Fighting Florida logo so you can use your theater of the mind to imagine the logo placed on a woman's shirt and just how awkward that is. And I'll also include the logo for Horses in the Morning, which we did not design, but it is one of the best podcast show arts I have ever seen. And the third sample that I'll include in this episode's show notes is for a client of ours whose show is called Accidental Landlord, because the graphic designer simply nailed it, expressing the concept of the show through the visual elements. So you'll see what I'm talking about. Check the show notes. And you may be naturally asking, where do we get show art, Producer Jemmy? Great question. So there are a few places to look. Your business's own internal or outsourced marketing team is the perfect place to start if you have one, because they will already know your color palette, your font preferences, your styling preferences, etc., etc. But you can also turn to Canva to DIY it. Just keep in mind that you can run into a wall trying to then trademark something that you've created in Canva or other such services. So as much as I love me some Canva, in fact, I have a link in the show notes, just be sure to avoid creating something you're going to want to later try to trademark. And where do you find talent when you want to have an artist create something original for you? There are great resources. I'll name a few. One is Fiverr. Fiverr is full of great graphic designers. There's also Upwork. Upwork is a website that I've used mostly for more technical stuff, like web developers who can do things that far exceed my own web design development skill set. I go to Upwork, but there are great graphic designers in there too. There are also graphic artist pages on Facebook and such that you can always go in and say, hey, I'm looking for someone. And you've heard me mention the Owl app before on this show, and the Owl app has some great graphic artists in there as well. Just be sure that wherever you find your graphic artist, be sure that your fee includes the cost of all of these as deliverables: your final show art in full, the individual elements of the show art, like I listed a little bit ago with transparent backgrounds as PNG files, and the project file itself, so that if you have a tiny tweak to make later, want to change one little color on something or whatever, you don't necessarily have to go out of pocket again and reach out to the graphic designer. Perhaps you can just change it yourself. So having that project file on hand is really, really handy. So make sure that's part of your deliverables as well. And as a quick tip for cutting down on your cost when using a graphic designer, create a concept piece in Canva first to give them. Because sometimes all the wordy explanations in the world can't really convey and tell them what you're really, really looking for. So create a concept piece in Canva and then have a graphic designer recreate it as an original, more professional piece. And as a quick mention, be sure that you are monetizing your expertise on the OWL app, spelled with 2 W's and 2 L's too. Even if you're not a graphic designer, I'm on there as a podcast expert, and there are experts from all kinds of areas on there, and they are monetizing their expertise with every call. And you should be too. Let people pick your brain after they first picked their payment method. Sign up with my referral code PL954123 and get your $10 credit. And remember, this was the second to last in the initial episodes of Podcasting Your Brand, where I'm laying out the very basics of launching your podcast. Up next in episode 42, I'll continue with part 4 of this technical side of launching, in which I'll take you through steps 7 and 8, hosting and distribution. In other words, let's finally get your show submitted to the platforms. Woo woo! And then, as mentioned, moving forward, I'll be labeling my episodes as either podcasting level 101 or level 102. Like, you may be thinking, well, you never covered naming a podcast, producer Jemmy. Hello. I need help with the name. And hello, you've also never mentioned music beds and where I get them. Where do I get those? Inquiring minds want to know. Yes, I hear you loud and clear. I'm going to be diving into that here as one of the very next episodes coming up, I promise. And that will definitely be labeled as a Podcasting 101 episode. And those 101 episodes will be mixed in among some of the content I have been dying to get to with you, my Podcasting 102 content. So moving forward, after not just this episode, but also the next episode, I'll be labeling my episodes as either Podcasting Level 101 or Level 102. So if you're not subscribed, be sure that you do. In the meantime, I have a whole host of free tips for you on my website. Just check out flintstonemedia.com/free tips. Thanks for tuning into Podcasting Your Brand. In this new chapter of the show, I'm revealing how you can harness the power of podcasting to expand your brand. So come and pick up what I've been putting down since 2014. Avoid common mistakes and propel your podcasting and branding forward. And if you have questions or are interested in becoming a sponsoring brand of this show, don't be shy. You can reach out to me anytime at Jemmy, spelled Jaime, at flintstonemedia.com. It's producer Jemmy signing off for now. Remember, the only thing more powerful than your voice is your spirit to use it. So turn that mic on.